Welcome to the deep dive. We're here to unpack complex ideas, uh, turn them into actionable insights, maybe some surprising facts along the way. And today we are really booking text. It's called The Perusia as Atavists Understand It by Mark Mountjoy. So our mission really is to explore Mountjoy's argument. It's quite nuanced and it challenges a very widely held view. We want to invite you to consider maybe a fuller picture of how God's victory was accomplished. Get ready, because we're going to unpack some, well, genuinely unexpected historical bits and prosthetic interpretations here.
Absolutely. And what's interesting right off the bat is how the author, Mountjoy, starts. He actually begins by acknowledging and showing appreciation for full preterist colleagues. You know, those who believe Christ's return, the judgment on the temple, all that was basically done and dusted in AD 70. He praises their commitment to Scripture, their insights. He sees them as correctly understanding that we are living in the fulfillment of God's promises. He's not trying to tear them down.
Okay, so it's not like a direct refutation. It's more like an invitation to broaden the scope, to expand the timeline. So if the common preterist view wraps things up neatly in 70 CE, how does Mountjoy see it differently? What's the core idea of his expanded view?
Well, his core proposal is that the Perusia Christ's return wasn't just a single moment in AD 70. He sees it as a much longer systematic campaign, spanning, believe it or not, 74 years, from 62 CE all the way to 136 CE.
74 years. Wow.
Yeah. And he uses this analogy, comparing it to the pattern of deliverance from Egypt. Remember, God didn't just snap his fingers and free Israel. No, it was a systematic campaign, the 10 plagues, right? Building pressure, escalating until Pharaoh finally broke. Mountjoy suggests Christ's return worked similarly, a kind of second Egypt campaign against the covenant-breaking system in Judea.
That's a really vivid analogy. Okay, so if the 70 CE view has merit, as he acknowledges, where does he argue it falls short? What makes it incomplete in his eyes?
Well, the crux of his argument is that pretericism, while correct on many points, is maybe operating on only half of the necessary framework, like half the picture. They rightly focus on that 40-year typological pattern. Think Israel wandering the wilderness for 40 years. In biblical terms, that often signals, judgment, disinheritance, and that fits the AD 70 timeline.
Okay, so that's one pattern, the 40-year judgment one. What's the other half then, the missing piece?
The missing half, according to Mountjoy, and this is really crucial, is the 70-year exilic period pattern. You have to remember, post-Second Temple Jews, especially after 70 CE, they were absolutely clinging to the hope that the temple's destruction was temporary. Just like the first time with Babylon. They fully expected national life, the temple, the sacrifices, all of it, to resume after 70 years, just like it did after the Babylonian exile.
Ah, right. So the idea that everything just stopped, finished in 70 CE, that would have sounded completely wrong to a Jewish person living in, say, 71 CE. They'd be thinking, okay, start the clock. 70 years.
Exactly. And the author argues that because the standard preterist view often overlooks this powerful 70-year restoration expectation, it can't fully account for what happened later. Specifically, things like the Kitos Wars around 115, 117 CE, which were huge Jewish revolts across the empire, and even more significantly, the massive Bar Kokhba revolt from 132 to 136 CE.
So Mountjoy is saying these later revolts weren't just like random aftershocks. They were intrinsically linked to this timeline, part of the unfolding plan.
Precisely. He argues they are integral. And he backs this up with some compelling biblical evidence that he believes points clearly to this longer prophetic timeline beyond AD 70, evidence that a purely AD 70 framework struggles to explain.
Okay, let's get into that. What's some of this evidence?
Well, first he points to Daniel 7.1. Daniel says that after the fourth beast's kingdom, its dominion is taken away, but then it says the rest of the beasts, which represent Babylon, Persia, Greece, their dominion was also taken away, but crucially, their lives were prolonged for a season and time. Mountjoy argues these earlier powers still had influence, they still struggled after AD 70, so you need more time for that prophecy to fully play out.
Okay, interesting. What else?
Then there's this concept he calls the divine halving of the prophetic week. It's a specific interpretation, but basically instead of one single 84-month period of tribulation or war, he suggests God strategically split it into two distinct 42-month judgment periods. The first one is the well-known run-up to AD 70, say 6770 CE. Then there's a second 42-month period later from 132 136 CE during the Bar Kokhba revolt. He sees this split as divinely planned for different stages of the victory.
A two-part judgment period.
Okay, he also brings up the seven thunders in Revelation 10.4. John hears them, but he's told to seal them up, not write them down. Mountjoy interprets this sealing before AD 70 as meaning their message was reserved. Reserved for the final phase of God's campaign against the unfaithful Hebrew nation, specifically unfolding in that second 42-month period, the 132-136 CE window.
So things kept hidden until later.
Right. And then there's Ezekiel 38:39, the prophecy of Gog and Magog, this huge final battle imagery. Mountjoy contends that this prophecy doesn't really find its fulfillment if everything starts at AD 70. He argues the Bar Kokhba revolt is the historical fulfillment of that final Gog-Magog scenario, symbolically echoed in Revelation 20.
Wow, connecting Bar Kokhba to Gog and Magog. That's a strong claim.
It is. And finally, he links the ultimate defeat of Bar Kokhba in 136 CE to prophecies about the final scattering of the power of the holy people. He points to Daniel 2.35, where the statue is smashed and becomes like chaff blown away, and also Revelation 20.11, the great white throne judgment, where earth and sky flee. He sees 136 CE as that moment, the final decisive scattering, the end of any collective power.
Okay, so putting all that together, what the author seems to be saying is that these different prophecies, they actually require a longer time frame. They don't all neatly resolve in 70 CE. And what this means for you listening is that from this perspective, these second century events, the Kido's War, Bar Kokhba, they aren't just historical footnotes. They're actually vital pieces of the prophetic puzzle, necessary to complete God's whole design. Mountjoy then lays out this 74-year campaign in 4 phases. So let's walk through those. Phase 1. The supernatural warning signs, running from 62 to 70 CE. He argues this phase kicked off in 62 CE with the martyrdom of James the Just, Jesus' brother. And significantly, he notes that just 43 days after James's death, after the crowd apparently cried out, "Hosanna to the Son of David," there were reports, like Josephus mentions, of supernatural armies appearing in the sky over Judea, fulfilling potentially a condition Jesus mentioned in Matthew 23.
That's right. And Josephus, the historian living through it, he documents this whole series of escalating supernatural signs leading up to 70. Things like strange lights over the temple at night, a cow giving birth to a lamb right as it was about to be sacrificed, these massive, heavy temple gates swinging open on their own, and even reports of voices heard coming from the Holy of Holies saying, "Let us depart." Mm-hmm. It's all building up, culminating, obviously, in AD 70 with the temple's destruction. That marks the end of phase 1.
Okay, so phase 1 ends with the temple destroyed. Then we move into phase 2, the systematic conquest from 70 to 73 CE. What happens here?
Well, the Romans didn't just pack up and leave after Jerusalem fell. They methodically went through Judea, taking down every last pocket of resistance, every stronghold. Places like Hebron, Machaerus, Herodium, and the final one, the famous fortress of Masada, which fell in 73 CE.
Right, Masada.
And Mountjoy highlights that moment when the last defenders at Masada chose suicide rather than surrender to Rome. He argues that with their deaths, the last vestiges of the Old Covenant system were essentially wiped out on earth. And this, he says, triggered something profound in the spiritual realm.
Which leads to phase 3, Satan's binding period, from 73 to 132 CE. What's the idea here? Binding Satan.
Yeah, this is a key part of his interpretation of Revelation 20. With the Old Covenant system totally gone, the temple destroyed, the priesthood finished, the last rebels dead. Mountjoy argues Satan was effectively bound for almost 60 years. He doesn't see this as purely metaphorical. He argues it was a real period where Satan's power to deceive, particularly regarding the Old Covenant system, was severely constrained. And what was the result on earth? Unprecedented growth for Christianity. Especially, he notes, among Jewish communities who were now sort of cut loose from the old structures and perhaps more open to the gospel.
So the binding isn't about all evil stopping, but specifically about Satan's power related to the Old Covenant system.
Exactly, and he emphasizes that the narrative logic of Revelation 20, in his view, requires this binding to look forward from AD 70, not backward into the past.
Okay, but Revelation 20 also says Satan must be loosed a little season. So when does that happen according to Mountjoy?
That brings us to phase 4. The final deception and Revelation 20's prophetic warning from 132 to 136 CE. He argues Satan was loosed in 132 CE, coinciding perfectly with the start of the Bar Kokhba revolt.
Okay. So the loosing of Satan directly fuels that final rebellion.
That's the argument. And this is where Mountjoy circles back to those two typologies we talked about, the 40-year one and the 70-year one. He says, yes, preterists correctly see the 40-year judgment pattern culminating in AD 70. But Revelation 20, he argues, is prophetically addressing the other pattern, the Jewish misunderstanding and misapplication of the 70-year restoration typology.
Right, because they saw the first temple destroyed, then restored after 70 years.
Exactly. Jeremiah had prophesied it. After 70 years in Babylon, God promised to bring them back, rebuild the temple. It happened.
So naturally, when the second temple was destroyed in 70 CE, many faithful Jews thought,
Okay, here we go again. This is 586 BCE, all over. Deja vu, terrible but temporary. God restored us before. After 70 years, he'll do it again. Their hope was pinned on that precedent. 70 CE plus 70 years means restoration is coming around 140 CE.
but the tragic irony, according to Mountjoy's view, based on a Christian perspective, is that they were basing this hope on a covenant.
A covenant that had been fulfilled, completed, and actually superseded by Christ's sacrifice and the new covenant. Their plans, however deeply felt and biblically based in their minds, were resting on essentially an expired contract.
That's a stark way to put it.
And the timing of the Bar Kokhba revolt itself is revealing, Mountjoy notes. It reportedly launched during the Feast of Sukkot, or Tabernacles, in the autumn of 132 CE. This timing wasn't accidental. It was likely calculated based precisely on their 70-year pesher, their interpretive framework pointing towards imminent restoration.
It's a Lupton Feast of Temporary Dwellings, right?
Yeah.
Emphasizing fragility, dependence on God.
Exactly. And the deep irony, Mountjoy points out, is that by launching a war based on their own strength and calculations during the very feast that teaches reliance on God and human frailty, they were sort of violating its core meaning.
And they actually started building a third temple.
Apparently so, laying foundations, not necessarily as an act of pure defiance against Rome initially, but more out of, well, faith. Faith in that 70-year restoration promise they believed was still active.
So Revelation 20, with its imagery of Satan being released for that final deception, the Gog-Magog battle, Mountjoy sees this as God's prophetic warning.
Yes, a warning specifically aimed at this misguided reliance on the 70-year pattern. It was prophetically signaling that this hope, this pesher, would lead not to restoration, but to an unprecedented disaster, the final disaster for national Israel.
Which helps explain maybe why Satan's final deception was so potent. It wasn't based on nothing. It was twisting a legitimate, historical, biblical pattern that had simply run its course and been replaced.
Precisely. It tapped into a deeply ingrained hope. And this leads Mountjoy to emphasize that the real battle here, while it involved Roman legions, wasn't fundamentally about Rome versus Judea. Many interpretations focus on Rome as the judge, the hammer. But he argues the deeper conflict was spiritual. It wasn't about political freedom. It was about finalizing the transition from the old covenant to the new against immense spiritual opposition.
So the primary enemy wasn't the Emperor Hadrian, but
Satan, in this view, exploiting that lingering Jewish attachment to the now obsolete temple system, specifically through their misreading of the 70-year restoration pattern.
and Rome's role in all this.
Fascinatingly, Mountjoy portrays Rome almost as God's unwitting instrument throughout the entire 74-year period. First, using Roman legions to judge the rebellious temple system leading up to AD 70. Then, arguably, the Roman peace, the Pax Romana, inadvertently protected the early Christian church during that binding period, allowing it to grow. And finally, Rome was the instrument used to crush Bar Kokhba's revolt, the last major attempt to reestablish the old system and build a third temple.
So Rome served God's purpose at each stage, even unknowingly.
That's the perspective. Bar Kokhba's ultimate defeat in 136 CE wasn't just a military loss. It marks the final decisive victory over both the political rebellion and the last gasp attempt to restore the sacrificial system Christ had rendered obsolete. Revelation 20's symbolism, its warning of that final battle and defeat, was, in Mountjoy's view, tragically and completely vindicated in the catastrophe of 136 CE, which effectively shattered those specific Jewish hopes for restoration permanently.
Okay, after all that destruction and judgment, the author takes us somewhere. So, well, quite beautiful, actually. The conclusion focuses on the New Jerusalem described in Revelation. Mountjoy argues this isn't just, symbolic language for the church. He sees it as describing a real place, an actual location where actual people live. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, they are there right now.
Yes, he connects it directly to Jesus' words. Remember when Jesus told the Roman centurion that many will come from the east and the west and will take their places at the feast with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven? Mountjoy takes that quite literally. Jesus was describing actual people sitting down at an actual heavenly banquet with the actual patriarchs in their actual home, the New Jerusalem.
So this whole 74-year campaign, from 62 to 136 CE, It wasn't just about tearing down the old system.
No, it was simultaneously about fully establishing access to this new reality, this heavenly home.
Christianity didn't just, win a theological debate over Judaism. In this view, it gained permanent open access for humanity to our true eternal dwelling place.
And this leads to Mountjoy's gentle challenge, particularly aimed at those holding a strictly 80-70 view. He suggests that while the preterist framework is correct in what it affirms, it might be operating on only half the equation. It's missing the other crucial factor that was driving Jewish consciousness, and importantly, Jewish action in the decades after 80-70.
Right, it comes back to those two biblical patterns. The preterist view focuses on the 40-year judgment typology, which fits 80-70. But Mountjoy insists we must also account for the fact that the Jewish people at the time were operating with two rationales. The 40-year one, yes, but also the powerful 70-year restoration typology.
Exactly. And if you ignore that second rationale, that deeply held 70-year hope based on the Babylonian return, Mountjoy argues you simply can't explain why Jewish resistance kept erupting with such, ferocity and regularity throughout the late 1st and early 2nd centuries. These weren't minor skirmishes.
It makes sense. Your view, if you hold it, that everything was totally finished in 70 CE. That would have been baffling, incomprehensible to a Jew living in 71 CE.
Absolutely. They weren't thinking, well, that's it then, game over. They were thinking, okay, the clock started 70 years. We wait for God's restoration just like our ancestors did after 586 BCE.
Yeah.
This expectation wasn't some fringe idea. Mountjoy stresses it was a central driving force behind the continued messianic fervor and these massive uprisings like Kitos and Bar Kokhba.
And the author loops this back to Revelation 20, suggesting it prophetically anticipated this very scenario.
Yes, he argues Revelation 20 was directly addressing this specific, dangerous misapplication of the 70-year restoration pattern. It was implicitly warning that relying on the Babylonian precedent in the post-Christ era would lead to another devastating national disappointment, another catastrophe.
So the Day of Visitation or the Parousia?
It wasn't a single 24-hour event, any more than the Exodus from Egypt was a single day. Mountjoy portrays it as a drawn-out, systematic, 74-year campaign. A campaign that methodically dismantled the old system and culminated in God's complete and final victory over every rival claim to his eternal priesthood and his eternal city.
And this longer view, this 74-year campaign idea, might shed light on some New Testament phrases.
Potentially, yes. Mountjoy suggests it could help us understand what Paul meant by phrases like the day of Jesus Christ in Philippians 1.6 or the day of our Lord Jesus Christ in 1 Corinthians 1.8. Well, think about how we use language. We talk about D-Day, right?
Yeah.
We often mean the entire Normandy campaign, the whole operation, not just the landings on June 6th itself.
Right. It signifies the whole event.
So maybe Paul's day of Jesus Christ wasn't referring to a single point in time either, but could have encompassed this entire 74-year period of Christ's progressive, systematic victory over the old covenant world. The whole campaign.
That's a fascinating thought. So, wrapping this up, what does this perspective mean for you, our listener?
Well, this deep dive suggests that understanding this dual typological framework, seeing both the 40-year judgment pattern and the 70-year restoration pattern that animated Jewish hope, might unlock a richer, perhaps more complete understanding of 1st and 2nd century history and prophecy.
And it leaves us with a question to ponder. If we consider a potentially longer, more systematic time frame for the fulfillment of these specific prophecies, how might that way of thinking shape your perspective on other biblical narratives, or even other historical events you might study? Lots to think about there. Thank you for joining us on this really deep dive into the Parousia as Atavists understand it. As always, keep digging, keep questioning, and keep exploring.